We have made it to the end of the off season. So now we are in seasonal mode. So is Evan Bland of the Omaha World Herald. Him and his fine crew, writers and designers, everybody did a great job on the college football preview that was in your newspaper yesterday. So kudos to you and the crew, and good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, thanks. It's a labor of love every year. A lot of folks on our design desk, and Sam and Tom, and it's a pretty cool piece that always comes together. I like the theme this year, arms race. So appreciate that. Hope people enjoyed reading it.
So, in the arms race, which is clearly laid out, and Nick and I have talked about plenty, let's do a grade here. The offseason essentially comes to an end today. If you had to grade the offseason from the Saturday after Iowa, the addition of Raiola, addition of other players, the subtraction of Evan Cooper, fall camp, the lead up to UTEP, what grade would you give Nebraska for an offseason from 23 into 24?
Uh, B plus, maybe A minus, somewhere in that range. There were very few negative things. I mean, the Evan Cooper thing certainly was one, but Nebraska quickly turned that into a positive with pivoting to John Butler and what they were able to do in that regard. On the recruiting trail, I mean, it wasn't perfect, but from landing Raiola and finishing that class well, and the way that they addressed a lot of their immediate needs in the portal, particularly at receiver, was a big deal for them. And, it was a positive offseason in a lot of ways. They had the chasing three stuff that came out that was popular. Nobody really got in trouble. Matt Rule kind of mentioned that last week. So yeah, maybe there were a couple issues, but for the most part, people stayed on task. And now that we're in game week, like the thing that I keep thinking about with Nebraska is like this felt like an offseason to me where they never got ahead of themselves. Like they always kind of knew there was stuff to do between wherever they were and the season opener. Like they weren't in any rush to name a starting quarterback. They weren't in any rush to start talking specifics about opponents or things like that. Like it felt like a very measured off season internally, just again in the sense that like they were embracing the grind, embracing the day-to-day stuff, trying to get a little bit better. And it sounds cliche, but like I think they believe it. I don't know that that's always been the case previous years with Nebraska, where sometimes the other stuff around the program can sort of take over. And this year it wasn't the case. Like even them moving into the dorms for 10 days, like that was a very minor talking point this year, and I think that's good because the focus was on the stuff that matters and not sort of the superfluous traditions or practices that they do outside of football. So I think in that sense, just from a mental standpoint, like the focus seems like it's been where it needs to be, and now it's about time to see how that all pays off in the field.
Evan, is there a position group, and again, we'll see a depth chart today, is there a position group that going into spring you had more concerns or questions about that you feel better about today going into week one?
Yeah, I mean, I think linebacker would be one for sure. Like, how do you move on from two of the better linebackers that Nebraska's had in the Big Ten era? And I mean, even with Javen Wright now out indefinitely, like I still think what John Bullock did in the offseason, how he's another year removed from his transition from safety to linebacker, like you feel pretty good about what he can do. The way that Mekhi Bayer's sort of quietly been a steadying presence in that room. Stephon Thompson's come on. Of course, what Vincent Shavers has done as a true freshman, he's been one of the surprise newcomers of that group. Like I thought that was going to be, something of a question mark into the offseason. And it could have been if Bullock had decided to move on and, you just didn't know maybe how that thing was going to come together. But I think that position group is awfully solid at this point. I think on the offensive side, I would still say, receiver too. I mean, that was you lost Billy Kemp from the off season, and Jalen Lloyd and Malachi Coleman had flashes, but they were kind of banged up. What would that look like? And I think they've both come back faster. And bigger and stronger. And then the way that Nebraska addressed that position group with Banks and Nayor coming in, again, in addition to what they've developed, and Ja'Cory Barney coming on as a true freshman, like that's another spot that, like, how many times in the last 10 years have we kind of wrung our hands at that position group? And it's like, man, either they don't have depth, or like their best guys aren't their most trusted guys when it comes to knowing the playbook and where to be. And it just kind of feels like they legitimately could have, 7, 8 guys that they could put out there at any given moment that could, help them win games, be game breakers, be assets to the offense. So I think that's another spot where they did a good job of both adding and developing in the offseason to get to where they are.
Evan Bland of the World Herald joining us. This is, I've labeled this year as the year to break streaks. Start 1-0, start 2-0, beat Wisconsin, go to a bowl game, all of those. But there's also a streak out there. The Nebraska hasn't had the same quarterback start the year, start every game, make it 1 through 12, and this will be 6 years since Tanner Lee in 17. So we know what Nebraska has at quarterback, but you know this, Evan, and Rule talked about his quarterbacks on Friday, and I'll be curious to see the depth chart today. How big of a gap do you think there is between, because this has come back to bite Nebraska in the back, how big of a gap do you think QB1 to QB2 is right now?
I mean, I think it's pretty sizable. And it's nothing against Heinrich Haarberg or Daniel Kalen. I mean, I think Nebraska sees Kalen as a guy, and Rule essentially said it these last couple of days, like they would like to redshirt him. They believe that he's a future Sunday type of player. But he physically has a ways to go still, I think, to get where they want him to be. And with Haarberg, assuming he's the number 2, like his skill set is a lot different than Dylan Raiola's skill set. And as we saw last year, the type of offense that Nebraska ran with Haarberg is not what we're going to see with Raiola. So, you mentioned the quarterback injury stat, or just Nebraska not being able to get through a year with the same guy. The thing that I'm watching with that is how much does Dylan Raiola run? Because we've seen, with Adrian Martinez and with Casey Thompson, even to a degree, and then last year with Sims, like when you run your quarterbacks a lot, you're more prone to injury and you're more prone to giveaways. And we saw a lot of that, of both of those things with Nebraska. So I don't anticipate that they're going to run Raiola nearly to the extent that we've seen Nebraska use that position and its legs in the past. So, the exposure for injury, I think, is a lot less. And if you are going to run with your quarterback, I mean, what better opportunity is there then to bring in Heinrich Haarberg as sort of a change-up wildcat threat, or to be creative in how he gets the ball, because he is one of the most explosive athletes on the roster. And I take Matt Rule at his word when he says, yeah, we have roles for Haarberg, and we're going to find a way to get him on the field and get him the ball and help him move the offense along. So, like, I think 2 things can be true. One being that Raiola is the clear number 1, but also that the guy behind him with a different skill set is going to absolutely be a key part of what this offense can do.
This is kind of similar to the question I asked you before, but I wanted to zone in specifically on the secondary, because I know with some new faces that we're going to obviously factor in, whether it was the corner opposite of Tommy Hill, or if we're going to see, basically the process of Deshaun Singleton coming back from injury, what he would look like. Marquise Buford named starting corner opposite of Tommy Hill. That was something that started to materialize a little bit over the past couple of weeks. When you look at that overall secondary for Nebraska, between the corners and the safeties and the options that they have, is that another area where maybe going in, it was a little more of a question mark? Now it looks like you have options and all of a sudden a lot of depth.
Yeah, I mean, that's a position group that's definitely solidified. I mean, you look around the starting secondary now, and that's 4 single-digit jersey numbers. I mean, that's a heck of a place to start, and that's without, the guy who was kind of projected to be that number 2 corner in Bly Hill, who's still working his way back. And so, like, what a luxury that is, that Nebraska can roll with the 4 guys you mentioned, with Singleton and Hartzog at safety and Buford and Hill at corner, and you still have Bly Hill, coming along, and you still have Sierra Wright, who has, major college football experience at USC, and you've got Amari Sanders and Mario Buford. And so like you can kind of see that position group, especially you can kind of see, all right, here's the clear group of starters this year, but then here's the next wave. Like here are the guys that are next up, barring an injury or, when this group of starters moves on, like you can kind of see how that position group is going to come together in the next few years. And I mean, there's leaders at that team too, at that position too. I mean, I think Malcolm Hartzog to me was maybe the surprise single-digit jersey of the group, but maybe he shouldn't have been. Just when I think back to just the last year and how respected he is in that roster and what he's been able to bring, a guy who kind of came out of small town Mississippi and earned everything that he got. So you kind of have a mix of guys from maybe more humble backgrounds, guys who are highly recruited, most who now have production at the major college football level. So it's certainly a group that's going to be an asset in terms of on-field production, but also maybe the biggest group of leaders on the team overall.
I'm going to say narrow it down to one, but you could give me a handful of guys. Who on this roster needs a hot start?
Any position group? Who needs a hot start? I think
maybe not hot. I'll use the word fast. Who needs a fast start?
I think the running back group at large needs a fast start. I think game one, whoever it is, like if it's Gabe Ervin who comes out and lights the field on fire, if it's Ramir Johnson, maybe two of those guys, like if you can be, because they have different skill sets and can be used differently. I think that's just a position group that's sort of been, I don't know if you want to say maligned, or it's been just kind of like people see it for what it is, I guess. I don't know how much optimism there is that group's going to be a huge asset to what the team has. But like if you come out against UTEP and, you can run for 150, 200 yards, whatever, and those guys look good, then suddenly that gives Colorado something to look at. Then suddenly that gives guys like Ervin and Ramir some confidence as they come back from injuries. Emmett Johnson, can he take that next step from what he did last year? Or Dante Dowdell, is he the guy? Is he more of maybe a game day guy? We saw what he did in the spring game, and maybe he didn't show out as much in practice. I kind of wonder if he's a guy who really turns it up when the lights come on. So I think that group, just in general, like there's been so much talk about what Raiola can bring to the offense, and rightfully so from a passing perspective, but like, how does that translate to the running game when defenses cannot any longer stack the box because they're not afraid of the pass game? Like now that they're guarding against that, what can these running backs do? How can that offensive line factor into that? So I think that's really what I'm looking at is, man, can they get the ground game going on a 3rd and 3 when it's an obvious run situation? Can they pound it through and get 4? I think there's just a lot to be said about the confidence that they can gain from having a good week one.
Evan, how closely, and I assume we'll all notice it if it goes bad, but how closely are you watching how this sideline handles not just the communication, the in-helmet communication, but maybe more importantly, which we got to see this last week, the 2-minute warning, 2-minute timeout, how they handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less of a deal for Nebraska than it is for a lot of schools because of Matt Rule and the fact that they've been working on the helmet communication and the rules or even potential rules for a year now. I mean, they did it in the spring. They said even in last fall in practices, they were working with the technology. So in the short term, I think that could be maybe an area where Nebraska finds a little bit of an edge just because they've been familiar with that technology. And like you look around college football, the handful of games last weekend, and you could tell like there were a lot of examples where whether it was offense or defense, people were maybe just struggling with the technology a little bit. Maybe there was maybe it was technical issues, maybe it was just inexperience using it in games. But just from what I've seen and from what Nebraska has said on how they've prepared, I think they're pretty ready for incorporating that technology into what they're doing. And then you just add in the fact that they're at home and things are a little bit more comfortable and familiar. I don't know that it's going to be much of an issue for Nebraska. Maybe it will be for the other side. But yeah, I think that's an area where maybe they can find a little bit of an advantage.
All right. It's finally here. I appreciate the conversation. Great work as always leading up to camp. And look forward to seeing you this weekend, Evan.
Yep. Sounds good, guys.